Good morning. I hope this vlog finds everybody well. It's been quite a bit since I made an entry, video entry, so I wanted to take the time and take the opportunity to do that now. A couple of pieces of information that are probably it's timely to deliver. A bit of a checkpoint, you could say. It's the end of the summer, 2022, August. And I had a couple of books that have been published, an article that's been published, and I also have begun a PhD program in computer science. So before my next class starts and before kind of the fall kicks in and we do a bunch of end-of-year things from a professional and business standpoint, I figured it made sense to do a quick checkpoint and just see where we are. Ultimately what we're trying to do here is kind of document this sort of intellectual journey, I guess you could say. For the record, you could say. So let's talk a little bit about the work and the trajectory of the work. So I published about 6 books now. So we've probably moved off of the hey, it's just a hobby type phase to something a little bit more serious and something that could be considered, like many authors, as sort of a lifetime type project. And so when you look at kind of the arc of that work, you can kind of see a little bit of a trajectory right now. And it seems to be clear which area and discipline I'm focused on and where I think that I can kind of make some headway with respect to what's out there, and kind of the state of knowledge, more generally speaking. So my first work was the Snow Cone Diaries, which was written probably 2010-ish, maybe 14 it was published. And that's more of a personal journey, but the intellectual pieces of that journey were started to be formulated. So there was a personal arc that was built into the story and narrative of a character called Charlie, and then there was an intellectual journey which sort of marries and runs parallel to the psychological journey. And a lot of the sort of questions about ancient philosophy and ancient theology and sort of why are we here, and what's the point of all this madness, start to sort of kick up the flooring and kick up the dust a little bit, and that in turn led to the larger project, which was Theology Reconsidered, which was really a book in 2 parts, which was, and here I'll get it to just show the girth of it. I have most of these books here. Why not, right? So this one was Snow Cone Diaries, which actually came out. You can see the bridge here, which is a constant theme relative to a dream that I had, which was published in let's say 2014. And the end of this is the beginning of this sort of metaphysical conception, which is really where I was sort of headed with all this, at least from a philosophical standpoint. And so that dovetails into this beast, okay, which is really, which follows the trajectory of intellectual development in the West, in antiquity, and also in China as well, in India, in antiquity, and then it sort of follows the development and trajectory of the intellectual development in the West through the Enlightenment into sort of modern day theoretical physics and then metaphysics, which is sort of, I begin to sort of formulate my ideas around metaphysics a little bit more explicitly. and also The Seeker, which is a book of poetry, which sort of tries to condense some of the sort of mystical and psychological work in a sort of a more, I shouldn't say palatable, but just a more condensed type setting. So, and that in turn has led to kind of a reformulation of metaphysics, which is very much Kantian, and this actually was just published, so this kind of gets to the point of why I'm going through these books right now. So this just came out. I actually wrote this, I think, a winter or two ago, but it took a while to get published for a variety of reasons. And this also was published. It's called IRA, an Ideological Reference Architecture. This was published in Open Journal of Scientific Research online. There's an abridged version that's online. This is the more in-depth version. Both of these books are more kind of technical from a metaphysics standpoint. So the idea is, we look at Kant from a sort of a Gnostic, kind of a mystic lens, see where we end up. And then in IRA, we actually build out a epistemological interpretation of quantum mechanics that sort of illustrates the process by which not only thought and ideas evolve, right, through time in a individual psyche, but also the relationship between the individual psyche and also the external world, the world inside and the world outside. And this sort of, the bridge and the connection which allows for the evolution of one's external reality and its relationship to its internal reality. So all of these, you could find most of this material is on my blog, snowconediaries.com, but and they're direct references and links to the books that are there as well. I need to do a quick update of that, but generally speaking, that's all there if you want to review that. And I've had some people come and ask, and I've sort of pushed them onto the site because it's again, it's created as sort of a set of breadcrumbs that people who are interested in this area can kind of jump in, follow the breadcrumbs. Everything is referenced. All my sources are referenced, and people can kind of follow my line of thinking and either build upon it or diverge into their own areas. I have another book that's going to be published here in short order, which is also something that I wrote a couple of years ago, Homo Mysticus, which is a much more mystical bent type work that talks that explores sacred geometry and some of the ancient theological texts in kind of a Gnostic way, which feeds into some of these works on metaphysics, but comes at it from a different angle. So that's sort of the body of work and sort of where we are, those announcements. So these books are available. I now have like 50 Metaphysics Reconsidered copies behind me that I have to unload, so calling bookstores and what have you. So that's sort of, you could see the arc of that project, okay, which is primarily, you have kind of a theological and sort of a mystical bent with respect to, quote unquote, the spiritual community, how they view the world, okay, which whether it's Hermetic doctrine or the Vedanta or Taoism or Buddhism or, the very sort of Eastern kind of holistic kind of a view of reality versus sort of the Western kind of reduction and kind of analytical approach. And through that and through a conjunction with that set of material, okay, which has a an empirical foundation, if you will, that's rooted in meditation and yoga and other mystical practices that are very old. Combine that with sort of theoretical physics, which is a lot of what we do in IRA, in this book to establish a system of metaphysics which is primarily epistemological in the sense that it's sort of knowledge based, right? So it's less material and more knowledge based. You have sort of material reality, which is sort of determined by and governed by the laws of physics, or probably better put, the laws of physics reflect how it is that we understand the material world operates, and from a variety of different perspectives relative to the material reality. And then you have kind of an epistemological reality, which is a reality of knowledge, which is sort of rooted in different principles. And it's hard to sort of get empirical about that sometimes. And so I've tried to, kind of push that discipline into a little bit more of sort of a rational foundation to kind of connect the two in a way. And the last leg of that is, sort of ties into a lot of my professional career and professional skill set, which is around computer science and software engineering and systems engineering. And, the perspective from that I have is that computer science and computer engineering specifically provides a fertile ground to test some of these metaphysical concepts, right? So not all that what you might say a radical thesis necessarily, but what I've found, for a variety of reasons, and that all make perfect sense, there's not too many computer scientists which are interested in metaphysics. There's a lot of philosophers that are interested in metaphysics for a variety of reasons, and there's mystics and folks in the spiritual community that are interested in metaphysics, but certainly computer scientists are interested in engineering problems, and they're interested in solving for engineering and technology problems in order to sort of move the systems in the global systems infrastructure forward, right? So whether it's cryptography or whether it's machine learning or any of these disciplines which are extremely technical and very deep, they are being pushed in certain areas because of funding primarily, to support the development and the advent of technology which has commercial application. That's the way academia more or less is set up, right? Because you're building academic programs which support the disciplines that in turn kind of have some sort of commercial value. There's a theoretical component to that which is very sort of academia specific, but primarily, particularly when you're talking about computer science and engineering, a lot of the theoretical work as well as the engineering work is being pushed in certain areas that are, quantum computing is big right now, machine learning and AI is big right now, and again, a lot of alignment with, as you might expect, with the commercial and kind of technological landscape, right? So, using that sort of thesis as a guide, that computer science and computer engineering in turn is a fertile ground for testing some of these metaphysical concepts, right? And metaphysical theses, right? I've applied to and been accepted to a PhD program in computer science. I have a master's in computer science, so pretty easy segue. And I've also been working in the industry for 25 plus years now, which tells you how old I am. And so, I've always had a great aptitude for that. I know about 5 or 6 different programming languages, maybe even more. I know a bunch of different platforms, been working with systems for a long time. And just like anything else, when you start working in a field for a long time, you start to sort of get an intuitive sense of how things work, and particularly around scalability and security, which are 2 areas that I focus quite a bit on. There seems to be applicability, or that's, again, the thesis. Now, I have a long road here. I just started my PhD program, doing everything part-time. So I'm looking at 4 to 6 years probably, more or less. I have a qualifying exam and all sorts of other things. But I've started. I took my first class, which was a deep learning class by a wonderful professor. A shout out to Professor Marquet, who really provided a really nice framework within which people can be introduced to some of these detailed, very technical concepts around AI and machine learning, which is called deep learning right now. And it's a field which has, gone through significant transformation and accelerated development over the last, let's say, 10 or 20 years due to the availability of computing resources, more or less, through the cloud and other technologies. So, there was a lot of restrictions with machine learning because of all the underlying processing that had to go on, sort of like computing in the very early days. And a lot of that sort of time from idea, concept, code to develop and to build has been streamlined and accelerated through the use of cloud technologies, parallel processing, distributed computing, and all that other stuff. And so it's extraordinary what is available for individual researchers right now to use to compute and solve for all sorts of interesting deep learning or artificial intelligence, really machine learning type problems. And so we went through that. There's really two different areas that we explored explicitly around deep learning. One is image processing, facial recognition, stuff like that, image classification, those types of problems. And the other is natural language processing, which is the processing of language, which has all sorts of applications. A lot of research is going into those two different areas, primarily because those are the areas that have commercial applicability, whether it's search engines or image processing or classification problems or, again, natural language processing, which is chatbots and all these other things that you're seeing everywhere right now, which is and it's becoming increasingly difficult to tell the difference between human beings and chatbots because they're getting very good at it. They just had, a couple of months ago, you actually had something that came out of Google AI. One of the researchers claimed that their chatbot was sentient, had certain rights and whatever. That wasn't received very well by Google and the management staff there, which is understandable. And anybody who knows, really how these things work, when you're building machine learning systems, you're training it. There's supervised training versus unsupervised training, but ultimately you're training it on data. There's inputs and there's outputs, and then based upon, what they call a loss function, based upon the variance between what your expected output is and your actual output is, over time, if there's enough data, you can actually train it to predict outcomes, more or less. And those outcomes from an NLP standpoint, natural language processing standpoint, could be, text that makes sense, that seems reasonable. So it's an amazing field, and it's transforming, really a lot of the technological landscape right now. And again, it is in very much is because of the availability of computing resources now, which is almost ubiquitous. So. Long way to go with the PhD, and as much flexibility as I thought I would have for a variety of reasons to pursue a specific line of research. Looks like I'm going to have to do some qualifying exams and material there too, which is a bit frustrating, but academia, for legitimate reasons, has ways that they do things, and they like to retain and keep control over their degrees for different programs, and I respect and understand that. But there's ways to go there. My next class is going to be about computational AI, which looks a little bit at some of the underlying geometric and mathematical structures which underpin these machine learning algorithms. So, in a nutshell, and you can sort of see as I describe this what the relationship is to metaphysics. But in a nutshell, what you have is ultimately data points, right? Ultimately, you have data points. Machine learning likes to deal with vectors, okay? And it likes to deal with numbers that are typically within the same scale or range, like between 0 and 1, for example. And if you can kind of resolve and normalize data sets into the vectors and numbers, n dimensions, ultimately, you then can apply certain algorithms to them to understand the relationship between inputs and outputs, build optimal algorithms to get from point A to point B, that in turn can scale and learn and evolve over time. That's really what machine learning is doing. And it's massive data sets. Okay, and the more data you have, the better the algorithm is. and you're just crunching a ton of numbers, and there's a ton of math involved, and there's different structures that are used for different types of problems, whether it's image classification or whether it's NLP. There's different types of structures. There's, which is interesting in and of itself. There's which has been written extensively about. There's a parallel between the brain and neurological processing and synapses, and also the way that some of these data structures that underpin machine learning have been set up, which is pretty much the same type of architecture. You have nodes, inputs and outputs, and then a relationship between the two, and then you have different algorithms which determine your relationship between inputs and outputs between each layer of the nodes, each layer of the architectures, and in turn that end up resolving to whatever it is that your problem set and your problem domain is in a nutshell. For anybody who's interested in this stuff, there's a ton of material online to help you understand how this stuff works. But there is clearly, and it's almost cliche, right? But the philosophical community and the computer science community, they're different communities that have different perspectives on this. The philosophical community has, speaking not as a subject matter expert, but someone that has been exposed to some of this material, how does thinking work relative to how do machines think? And despite the fact that the underlying architecture is extremely similar, right? Hey, this design pattern actually is very useful for thinking and resolving, right? As we understand it from an AI perspective. And also it seems to be the same structure that underlies the brain. Well, is that coincidence? Is that, how relevant is that? How relevant is that to how it is that we think? There's a whole body of work that's meant to study this, primarily in the philosophical literature. Computer scientists don't want to have anything to do with this. I mean, I got to tell you, my thesis and my presentation to my engineering and computer science professors and teachers, parts of these committees that I'm starting to interface with, they think my work is relatively interesting, but none of them are doing anything in this field. For good reason, because there's very, very little practical application in the engineering disciplines that they're focused on doing their research in. And so that does leave for an opportunity for someone to bridge this gap that has a deep background in computer science and computer engineering, but also understands the philosophical problem and understands the sort of theoretical physics or underlying ontological issues relative to mysticism and metaphysics and all these other pieces. Whether or not I can kind of pull all those together in a dissertation and have it be approved by a committee remains to be seen. But that's really at least the going-in plan. And so that's kind of how all these pieces fit together. That's the arc of the project. This is probably a little bit of a sojourn, a little bit of a divergence to focus a little bit deep in the computer science and the computer engineering field, so that I really understand what it is that I'm talking about when I delve into these areas, and also that there's an additional level of credibility with my work in general, as it relates to the quality and as it relates to the topics and that I write about. So that's where we are. A couple of things that have come out. The degree pursuit has begun. So we'll go down a couple of different rabbit holes around AI, machine learning. There'll be some core requirements that I have to take, but I'll try and chirp in on how that journey is going over time, so that the folks that are interested can kind of see where we are. Haven't been doing very much writing at all. Most of the stuff that I've been doing is research around the computer science and the engineering piece, and of course the work stuff, which definitely is the majority of where my focus and energy is on a day-to-day basis. All right, so I've talked a little bit about that. I've talked about that. So 2 more things that I'll touch on before I leave you Snow Cone Diaries will probably be rebranded soon. Notes from the Underground is probably where we're going to go with that. I'm someone that helps me with the site. There'll be some rebranding around that. Probably makes more sense. It's a reference to a Dostoevsky book, I believe, which I have not read, which I probably should read. But same type of idea, right? There's sort of a reflective kind of backdrop perspective on the nature of reality, on the nature of society, and where we are in our current sort of age of development. And so, Notes from the Underground is probably a good a good and better brand for that work. Juan Valdez is primarily what that the author that's associated with that work, my pseudonym. And the last thing I'll talk a little bit about is the general economic conditions, which I think are worth spending a couple of minutes on. As you look at, as I look at metaphysics, as I look at mysticism, as I look at engineering, each of which has a sort of a part to play, more on the mystical and the spiritual side and the computer engineering side in terms of the development of society. You have, of course, very high inflation, logistical supply chain issues. You've got the war in the Ukraine right now. You've got all this debate around energy. You've got all this debate about climate change. A lot of big heat waves going through Europe, for example, right now. And we're definitely in a time of transition. And at some level, right, from a Heraclitus standpoint, you're right, you never step in the same river twice, right? Okay. But you do have these sort of shifts in socio-political structures, socioeconomic structures, and we definitely are living through one of those now. Much of that, or at least there was, the pandemic provided sort of the impetus for driving a lot of that socio-political and socioeconomic change, particularly in the West. And you can see that with the sort of migration of the workforce, right? Despite the fact that we're in quote unquote a recession as it relates to economic growth here in the West, particularly in the United States, you still have high demand for wages, right? And high demand for jobs. We still have a dearth of talent here in a variety of different industries, particularly in tech and in cyber. And so wages are increasing, right? So which is part of this sort of inflationary pressure that we have as gas prices have almost doubled. And given all these supply chain challenges that we've had that, stem from Asia, or whether it's the breadbasket of Africa and in the Ukraine, or oil and gas supplies, right, that are coming out of Russia, all of that has kind of pinched energy and the global supply chain, which has driven up prices. And then you also have kind of this sociological change and shift that's happening as people have kind of moved away from the sort of traditional jobs and going to the office to transitioning to more of a sort of a home office, remote work, and what you might call sort of a greater symbiotic relationship between work and personal life, right? I mean, I certainly see this in our company, right? As people have gone away from the office and are sort of set up to be able to work remotely from home, as we have since the beginning of the pandemic, you get sort of a work personal life blend that you didn't necessarily have before. Before it was a very sort of clean demarcation. You don't necessarily have that now. And people have more time to reflect on what it is that they want to do. And because that there is demand for workers in a variety of industries, there's been a lot of shifts that have gone on in the workplace. And these continue to happen. I think they call it the great, there's a couple of names that people have. My undergraduate degree was in economics. So these are areas of interest to me. And you can also see that, the general economic conditions as it relates to the stock market or, again, inflation, and how that in turn is a reflection of where people's mindsets are. Because ultimately, for example, stocks are a reflection of what people believe future earnings to be. So in many respects, people, psychology is sort of buried in the economic discipline in a very sort of fundamental way, as it should be, right? And as more people see kind of the references to the recession, prices go up, people sort of start to pinch their wallets, the economy starts to shift. and it's, there's a reason why they call it not a restructuring, but there's a reason why they call it almost a reset. The word escapes me. But essentially, what you have is sort of a restructuring of resources across the economic landscape to reflect people's current perceptions on the world, their perceptions in their their place in their socio-political context, and where they feel they are economically generally, right, in terms of what they think future earnings are going to be, or people that have gotten hit the hardest are the people sort of on the, as usual, right, the low end of the stick. Inflation tends to hit the poor the hardest, right? They're the ones that are just struggling to make ends meet and put food on the table for their families, and a lot of that stuff has almost doubled in the last 18 to 24 months. And so certainly their wages haven't caught up to that yet. And so this sort of buying power notion, which has been almost cut in half, is brutal for a lot of people. And so it's being addressed from a variety of different corners. I just passed a bill around green energy and stuff like that as well, some additional taxes to corporations. And be you're on the right or the left side of the spectrum there, they are looking to try and address some of these conditions. And I would expect that inflation would sort of level out here as we kind of reset to a new normal where, we're less dependent upon Russian oil, less dependent upon some of these logistical and supply chain issues that are coming from the East. Prices sort of stabilize into a new normal based upon, current state of affairs. It's a good time personally to, I'm going through this process now. I got a couple of kids in school, to kind of do a reset in terms of where you are and how to proceed going forward with building in the fact that your buying power has decreased significantly, and we've taken a significant step back. Things will start kicking back in a little bit too, presuming that that war in the Ukraine doesn't spill over and get worse, which I think we've gone through. I think most of the risk there is behind us with respect to that, but you never know. There's always the risk of escalation, but it's a good opportunity to kind of reset and retrench and replan in terms of the next 6 months, the next year, and the next 3 to 5, if you're thinking that far ahead. There should be good opportunities for the youth in terms of types of things to do and different jobs, as the job market is still pretty good. It may not be exactly the job that you want, but there are jobs that are out there for young people that are coming up right now. People should take advantage of that and learn as much as they can, for sure. And that's probably it from the notes from the underground. It is August 8th on a Monday morning here before my workday starts. Namaste. Everybody take care and peace out.